Look at the adults sitting around your dining room table. If they are African American, odds are they have high blood pressure. In this episode, you will discover the research of a genomic historian discussing why genetics and not race predisposes African Americans to high blood pressure and the recommended treatment. My guest is Dr. Constance Hilliard. What she tells you just may save your life.
Listen, I started Harvard as a freshman in 1967. I was so eager to learn about my African ancestry. But when I got there, I did not realize that there was no such thing as African history in any American university in 1967. The chairman of the Harvard Department of History he was trying to be kind, and he said, Africa doesn't have a history. Don't waste your time and the opportunity you have at this university. Huh. Well, I felt that I knew better than him, but it's not as though I knew any African history. I had a friend, an Ethiopian friend, and I told him, and he said, Connie, don't worry about it. Study Arabic, and at least you will have a base for doing your own research in African history. This person, he was a graduate student. He knows 15 languages. He's a classical scholar, but not classical Greek Latin. Classical in terms of the Semitic languages that were the language that Jesus Christ spoke, Aramaic and Akkadian and Ge'ez, which is the Semitic language of ancient Ethiopia, and so forth, those kinds of languages. And he said that if you study Arabic, you will be able to at least access manuscripts that have never even been translated that relate to certain areas of Africa. Okay, so I'm sitting in this Arabic class, and everybody else, they're like graduate students or whatever. Why would some freshman be taking this course? Whatever. I'm sitting there for 2 weeks. She calls me up to her desk or whatever, and she starts asking me questions about myself and my interests. And she took me under her wing because I told her I was interested in studying about my own history and studying about Africa. And that's why I was in the class. And my whole career at Harvard, she worked with me to translate Arabic manuscripts from Timbuktu, from ancient Mali, from ancient Ghana. And that became the basis of my work, just initially my work as a historian. And for my dissertation, I was therefore able to translate some manuscripts that had never been translated before because there's such a large corpus of knowledge in Arabic, not for all of Africa, just for very particular areas. I got my PhD from Harvard, and my work was primarily in Senegal, where I was translating Arabic manuscripts and so forth. But over the course of years, my historical interest as an Africanist expanded. And I have done just a lot of work in teaching and exploring many aspects of African history. About 15 years ago, I was a Fulbright visiting professor in Japan. And as I was about to leave, 2 weeks before, my stint was over, it was a wonderful experience, but I decided, oh, I am going to take advantage of their fantastic medical system and get a checkup. Just, get a checkup. And so I went for a checkup and they were very thorough. I think it cost me $15. And, blood tests and looking at all kinds of things and whatever. The doctor called me back and essentially he said that I was dying of kidney failure. And he said, as soon because I was 2 weeks from going back home. And so he said, we're not going to do anything here. But as soon as you get back to Texas, you need to immediately get medical attention. But then he said, you're the healthiest looking person at that level of the disease that I've ever seen. Now, I thought, oh, well, that's a nice compliment given the fact that I'm really in horrible shape. So I get back home and I just immediately go to see my primary care physician and I tell him I have kidney failure and whatever. And he just kind of smiles. He says, Connie, you don't have kidney failure. And he shows me the form, the lab form. And on the lab form, he had checked off African American. Well, I looked at that and I said, well, what does that have to do with anything? He says, I don't know. It's some kind of laboratory algorithm or whatever. And that's what he left me with. So when my doctor says, oh, no, you're fine, my I was in a very deep dilemma. First, I was, of course, extremely relieved, but I couldn't sleep because I had spent my whole career explaining to students that race was a social construct. It's not real. So, how in heaven's name could I have been misdiagnosed because of my darn race? And then, oh, listen, this is so unbelievable. What happened? I woke up one day and I realized I have the answer. Now, listen, well, this is really my story because I mean, my story in the sense that when I woke up that morning saying, oh, I know why the mistake was made, it was because I hate to say it, 50 years ago, when I was translating these manuscripts from Timbuktu, what was I learning? I was learning that I had knowledge that had never even been written in American history books because Europeans knew nothing about the interior of West Africa, where my ancestors came from. All they knew was that these people were brought to the coast in chains and uploaded onto ships. Every bit of American history relating to the transatlantic slave trade begins right there. And so I was not only filling in some knowledge, but in doing so, I realized that there was surely a connection between the fact that African Americans of slave descent, specifically, um, had such high levels of salt sensitive hypertension leading to kidney failure. There were these powerful, wealthy empires in the deep interior of West Africa. The reason they were so wealthy was because of this remarkable trade. It was a trade it was transactions where rock salt was being traded for gold. Now, the population outside the boundaries of these powerful empires, they are the ancestors of African Americans. And let me explain. What happened was eventually the gold ran out. The peasants, as opposed to the elites who were doing these transactions, had never tasted salt. Their sodium intake came from the ashes of millet leaves, which is high in potassium chloride, and from whatever meat they were eating. So it was one of the societies, and now we're aware that there are some other societies in the world that are essentially saltless. But of course, all humans have to have sodium. But saltless societies are genetically adapted to functioning well, I mean, functioning perfectly on low levels of salt because that is their genetic adaptation. So when the gold ran out, the populations on the coast, because eventually the gold trade was lost by the Muslims and it became the Portuguese from the coast who were now engaging in this gold trade. When the gold ran out, the militarized nations on the coast were looking for a new commodity that would have the same value as gold. By that time, Christopher Columbus had opened up North and South America to European settlement, and the absolute most precious commodity that the global market at that time, we're talking about the 1600s, needed was highly skilled farm labor. Highly skilled farm labor. Where can that be gotten? West Africans were highly skilled farmers. West Africans in the areas where the gold had initially been mined were not only highly skilled farmers, but very vulnerable to being kidnapped and enslaved because they weren't in those powerful empires, and the empires had disintegrated anyhow. Um, they were in decentralized societies like village communities in this huge region. That's why they became known as Black gold. That's our ancestors. They were Black gold. African Americans of slave descent are not from the coast. They are from the deep interior. The deep interior is one of the most sodium deficient regions in Africa. It turns out that disease is population specific, not race specific, population specific. And that means that populations in a very localized environment will have become adapted to the food source and the climate and certain whatever the microbial issues are in that particular environment. Now, of course, we're all human and we all have the exact same number of genes, but that's where the 324 million gene variants come in. But see, the point I'm making is that in order to really get at specific diseases, we have to be able to stratify populations, meaning that a particular group that shares the same gene variants for the same disease when we find that, it's like a miracle because then we can find pharmaceuticals that can attack or block, not or block those particular gene variants. That's when precision medicine works extraordinarily well. But guess what? There is virtually research, no research on specific gene variants carried by African Americans of slave descent. And this is why I differentiate the fact that most African Americans who are recent immigrants to our country, they have a different genetic profile because most often they come from capital cities in coastal regions. And as a consequence, they will have the same salt intake and salt intake needs as most Americans, as Northern Europeans. But when you're thinking about it, the better way to say it is you're not going to find other Africans with that genetic variation because you're not going to find Europeans with it. You're not going to find coastal Africans with it. You're only going to find West Africans from the interior with it. It's that simple. It's a localized population. Uh, that's what these population specific disease triggers are.
What are you suggesting that we do?
Oh, okay, I'm suggesting that we should be aware of our sodium intake. And secondly, if we begin to show evidence of high blood pressure, rather than even wait to do various tests to figure out if it's salt sensitive or systemic, we need to follow the medical protocol that has already been established that says people with salt sensitive hypertension should reduce their sodium intake to 1,500 milligrams a day. It's that simple. It's not as though I'm making up, oh, we should do this or that. The medical protocol for salt sensitive hypertension is 1,500 milligrams a day. How many Black people know that? Race is not scientific, it's a social construct. What I'm talking about has nothing to do with race. I have had to create a model to show that putting all West Africans together is dangerous. It's dangerous because, first of all, Africans have the largest amount of genetic diversity of all human populations to begin with. Secondly, the reason the salt theories, no, they weren't even discounted. That is now urban legend. It's like a joke. But the problem is the real clues have been completely lost and misconstrued because populations living, for instance, on the top of the Himalayas have certain genetic variants that are adapted to that environment. Populations that live in the Atacama Desert of Chile have certain variants that allow them to function in an arsenic high environment. Human beings, if we're going to look and really look for cures in a genetic way, we can't use race. Race is a billion people. That has nothing to do with anything. We
Okay.
have to understand the particular ecological environment that they are genetically adapted to. That's what the gene variants are. There are 324 million gene variants. And I promise you, the problem we as African Americans are having today is the fact that it is only the gene variants carried by people of European ancestry that are being identified for disease triggers. Populations of European ancestry, specifically Northern Europeans, their genetic profile is not even exactly the same as Southern Europeans.
Right.
It is Northern Europeans for whom we have such an incredible amount of data. And the reason that is so important is because it turns out that disease is population specific, not race specific, population specific. And that means that populations in a very localized environment will have become adapted to the food source and the climate and uh, certain whatever the microbial issues are in that particular environment. Now, of course, that, we're all human and we all have the exact same number of genes, but that's where the 324 million gene variants come in. But see, the point I'm making is that in order to really get at specific diseases, we have to be able to stratify populations, meaning that a particular group that shares the same gene variants for the same disease, when we find that, it's like a miracle because then we can find pharmaceuticals that can attack or block, not or block those particular gene variants. That's when precision medicine works extraordinarily well. The literature, the medical literature, it doesn't listen. Wait, I'm sorry. I have to tell you, when you get into this medical literature, it doesn't even have to make any damn sense. If it's dealing with African Americans, the quality is so poor that it's like, yeah, just go ahead and do it. Because APOL1 mediated kidney disease will be triggered when you find your patients having G1 and G2 or two copies of G1 or two copies of G2. So when we go back and look at G1 and G2, if we look at it carefully, geneticists have shown that it's highly absorptive of sodium. The significance of that is that this is what allows populations to live in that environment. But see, now that I can say that, it leads to prevention, a prevention being that African Americans of slave descent have to become very aware of their sodium consumption and work towards consuming no more than 1,500 milligrams a day. But now listen, I come along as a historian who has very specialized expertise in the particular ecological environment African Americans came from. And I can say definitively that our ancestors consumed less than 500 milligrams of sodium per day. They were able to do that because of G1 and G2 of the APOL1 gene. But when you go from less than 500 to 5,000, you're going to be dropping dead. And 11,000 African Americans are dying every year from this chronic kidney disease syndrome. And as I said, researchers have no cure there. What is killing us, as I said, is sodium levels that are 1,000 times higher than what our ancestors are genetically adapted to. And the thing is, the medical literature shows it.
It,
It's just that those interpreting it, so they've not even made the connection. Because remember the slave ship hypothesis, and maybe because the people were thrown off the ship, and the this and the that, and it had become an urban legend. What if in the 1980s we had actually taken it seriously? How many people's lives would have been saved? 75% of African Americans over the age of 55, guess what they have? Salt sensitive hypertension.
this is a call out to doctors, researchers, historians, and otherwise concerned persons to share your story, to share your data so that we can continue this conversation.